Sidetrack episode 51, Apocalypse by Numbers. Welcome back to A to Z History Presents The History of the Papacy. The History of the Papacy podcast is a proud member of the Agora podcast network. We're a group of independent podcasters. Our goal is to create thought-provoking and high-quality podcasts and audio entertainment. This month, I'd like to share the Agora Podcast Network's original content feed. Agora original content is thought-provoking and covers a wide variety of topics, including current events, international relations, interviews with some of your favorite podcasters, and much, much more. It's really great audio entertainment programming that I think you will enjoy. Learn more at agorapodcastnetwork.com. If you've ever thought of supporting the show, Patreon's a great way to do it. Thank you to our Constantinople-level patrons Regan, Sandy, Andy, Paul, and Dr. Jeff, as well as Alexandria-level patron Chris. I've included a link as well in the show notes to my Amazon wish list. When you're checking out at Amazon and your cart just is feeling a little light there, think about adding one more item to your cart. It would be greatly appreciated and it would help out tremendously. This is the 7th installment of Garry and Steve's Guide to the Apocalypse podcast series. Today we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the Apocalypse of John, also known as the Book of Revelation. There's a lot of symbology and numerology in this book, and we try to scratch the surface of all of this complicated mess, if you will, of the Book of Revelation. We try and sort it out and make at least some sense of it. We hope you're enjoying this series, and please feel free to share your comments with us. All the ways to get in contact, such as email, Facebook, Twitter, etc., can be found at a2zhistorypage.com. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the apocalypse. It is nigh, after all. Let's dive right in and start looking at how the Book of Revelation was and is interpreted. The book crams in just about every figurative and allegorical method you can use in literature.
And also we're going to dive into Revelation's very deep roots in all the apocalyptic and Old Testament literature.
So we can really only hope to scratch the surface here, but it's a good start.
It is a good start. And if you can make more sense of Revelation than we can, it probably won't be too hard, please email.
Generally, there's 3 schools of the way that the book is interpreted. There's the preterist, the historical, and the futurist. The preterist is saying that all of this was basically it all happened in the past. Mm-hmm. The historical is saying that some of it's happened in the past and some of it's imminent. What imminent means is up for interpretation. And then the futurist is saying that none of it's happened yet. It's all going to happen in the future. And the futurist is where you would get things like the Left Behind book series. Rapture, even though the rapture doesn't come directly from the Book of Revelation, it's that whole idea comes from interpreting Revelation as a handbook of what's going to happen.
Yes, and of course it depends when you're writing. I think Revelation during the Napoleonic Wars was interpreted as predicting Napoleon and the end of the world. And of course today, a lot of people still read it like that, saying the world's going to end real soon, real soon.
Sacramental Christians like the Eastern Orthodox, the Oriental Orthodox, like the Copts and the Catholics and the Anglicans, they interpreted almost completely in the historical and the preterist camps, with a little bit of futurists dabbled in there, where when you start getting into the Protestants, they're teaching it more, and not all of them. It's with the Protestants, it's always difficult to nail one interpretation in there, but a lot of the wackier interpretations are taking it completely literally and in the futurist. Like when we get that there's only 144,000 people who will go to heaven, that's taking it very literally and in the future.
Yes, the sacramental churches seem to go out of their way to minimize revelation. I was just looking at the Revised Common Lectionary, which seems to be a modern set of readings which have been adopted by quite a number of major Protestant denominations. And the readings which they've adopted in the yearly cycle of readings are completely atypical of Revelation, and they've got the nice bits. And I'll give you an example. Here's Revelation 22:12, and this is in the lectionary. See, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, to repay according to everyone's work. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they will have the right to the tree of life, and may enter the city by the gates. It is I, Jesus, who sent my angel to you with this testimony for the churches. I am the root and descendant of David, the bright morning star. Now, those are the verses in the lectionary, but they've omitted a verse in the middle there, and they've omitted it for a very good reason. Now, just listen to this. This is verse 15. Outside are the dogs and sorcerers and fornicators and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. So they've dropped that from the lectionary because it's a little bit embarrassing.
Yeah, and the ones that made it into the lectionary are so vanilla.
Yeah, they're vanilla. But from what I can gather, the Episcopal churches find Revelation a little bit of an embarrassment.
Generally, the Western Christians, the Roman Catholics and the Protestants, are more accepting of Revelation as a teaching document. I guess that's something that the four canonical Gospels and then the epistles or the letters are really, they're a manual for Christianity, for the religion. They're the way that they teach people what the religion's about, where Revelation is tricky to use it as a teaching tool directly. The Catholics use it, and they're pretty much, when they include it in their readings lists, are pretty much the vanilla chapters and verses.
Yeah.
The Eastern Orthodox do not include it at all in their weekly readings. I guess that's something that maybe not everybody is aware of. Most churches have a set list of readings that they do on certain days, certain Sundays, and it follows a pattern. You can look it up online, and that's very accessible. And especially amongst the Christians, like the sacramental ones, I think it's laid out to infinity of how this is the Sunday of da-da-da-da-da, and this is the gospel that's read, and this is the epistle that's read. I think in a lot of evangelical and Protestant traditions, the individual pastors given a little bit more license on what they're able to read, but that's, we could probably talk about that for 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
The Eastern Orthodox do not read that book at all during their reading cycle. The Copts in the Oriental Orthodox Communion read the whole entire book in one day, 6 days after Easter. And then, like we said, the Assyrian Orthodox don't include it in their canon, so they're not reading it at all.
That, yes, what's the name of that day again, Steve? What is it?
It is called Apocalypse Night. Isn't that a name and a half? Apocalypse Night?
Apocalypse Night. I mean, if it was the first time you'd ever heard of it, you'd be going, what? Oh, Mum, do we have to go to this?
That sounds like something that they would do around Halloween time.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Seems a bit of a funny place for us. What, first Saturday after Easter?
In amongst the Orthodox, the Eastern and the Oriental Orthodox, that week after Easter is called Bright Week.
Oh, okay.
In Bright Week, there's no fasting on the usual fasting days. and it's pretty much it's a time to let your hair down after Lent.
Oh, like Mardi Gras.
Yeah. Or what do they have in Dingus Day and
what?
Amongst the Eastern Europeans?
Dingus Day?
It's the Monday after Easter where you just completely go all out. It's not celebrated as much in Poland now as it is in the diaspora of Poles.
Oh, okay.
But it's a tradition. I don't know if that's something that maybe communism tamped down on.
Right.
But it's I happen to live in a place that has a lot of Polish immigrants to it.
Oh, okay.
But it's one of those. It's a celebration after the fast. And that's kind of what Bright Week is. So I almost wonder if that reading of Apocalypse on the last day of Bright Week's kind of trying to rein you back in.
I think that'd be a very effective downer at the end of the week, wouldn't it? Geez, you wouldn't want to go there if you're bombed out of your brain, would you? Where are we? What? Ah!
It's not a terribly long book, but to read it straight through would be 3-4 hours.
And it'd be a tricky book to read because it's not straight narrative, which you can follow quite easily. There's so much crazy imagery in it.
Yeah, it doesn't follow the standard narrative arc that we're accustomed to in English writing style, where it's building up, there's a climax, and then it goes towards a conclusion. There's a lot of building up and climax, and then it goes down and up and down. That's what I felt like reading it, going through it that first time when I did. You would think, oh, wow, it's going to end now. But then there's some more,
Yeah, then there's some more. Yeah. There's the visions of the 7 bowls. You're thinking, well, that was pretty heavy. Now we have the 7 trumpets. Oh, no, it keeps going. Oh.
And a lot of the things that I thought were going to be really heavy, like the 4 horsemen, wasn't quite as heavy as I thought it would be.
No, that's true, actually. In popular culture, we've picked out a lot of images, like the 4 horsemen, which aren't really that important in the book, are they? I mean, they're there, but they aren't, apocalyptic in a sense. Like the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls go on for chapters. But the 4 horsemen is just 1 or 2 paragraphs, I think.
The 4 horsemen is a great chapter that's been interpreted many different ways. And I think it's almost a part of the common lexicon. That's what people think of, like, whoa, the stuff's hitting the fan when the 4 horsemen come. But the common interpretation is the white horse comes, and that's actually Jesus. And if for the preterists and the historicals school, that's when Jesus comes in the 30s AD, and then all the other ones come. There's the fiery red horse, and then there's the one that can kill people with the sword, and there's war and pestilence and all that stuff. That's the things that are saying that on earth it's going to be pretty crappy, for Jesus came, but with all that, there's these other horsemen that were always there. It's kind of a way of saying that there's still, Jesus is coming again, and you better bunker down for that time when Jesus isn't here, because there's those other 3 horsemen.
Yeah, it's the 3 horsemen of the apocalypse. Damn, that ruins everything.
Yeah. Yeah, when you take that first horseman out, it becomes not quite as exciting.
Yes, Steve, just to show how connected Revelation is with the Old Testament. The horseman mentioned in chapter 6 of Revelation also comes straight out of Zechariah. Now, I'm going to quote from Zechariah 1:8 and Zechariah 6:1. And here's what the prophet Zechariah says. In the night I had a vision. I saw a man mounted on a bay horse, standing among the myrtles in the deep, and behind him were bay, sorrel, and white horses. I looked up again, and I saw 4 chariots were coming out from between the 2 mountains. The mountains were of copper. The horses of the first chariot were bay. The horses of the second chariot were black. The horses of the third chariot were white. And the horses of the fourth chariot were spotted, dappled. So there's another image in Revelation which is tied completely to Zechariah, and presumably the early community which was listening to Revelation would have gone, oh yeah, Zechariah, of course.
And there again, that's really what they're aiming. That's what that writer of Revelation is. He's aiming it at this Jewish community, saying, come on, guys, let's get on board already. I thought that this is a good time to talk about there's 4 horsemen, but that number, the numbers keep coming up time and time again, especially like you said, that number 7. And the number 7, as far as I've researched, it represents perfection. Does that have any throwbacks to the Old Testament, that number 7? What I read was that it's like 7 days of creation.
I think it must tie into that. Offhand, I can't think. I know the number 7 does appear a lot in the Old Testament. I mean, 7 days of the week, it's the classic thing, I suppose, isn't it? A jubilee, which is 7 times 7, 49 years. And from what I understand, the Israelites got the number 7 from the Babylonians, I think.
Well, was it 6 days of creation, 6 days, and then the 7th was...
That's right, he rests.
That comes into where we quoted it earlier, where Jesus says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. That ties in with the message, again, of saying that Jesus was divine and the Logos, the creative force, because Alpha was the first letter of the Greek alphabet, A. Omega was actually the last letter of the Greek alphabet, not Z or Z. Alpha the first. So he's the beginning and the end. Jesus is there at creation and he's there at judgment. The beginning and the end.
Yeah, Revelation 1:8. I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty.
The Greeks took the Phoenician alphabet, and the Phoenician alphabet was all consonants because they're the way it was transcribed, vowels weren't quite as important, and that's where the like a lot of times with like the Old Testament scrolls that Jews read at their services or in Arabic writing, it's just vowels are marked off with little dots. They're called diacritics, where in Indo-European languages like Greek, vowels are much more important. And when they needed vowels, they invented these couple of vowels, omega, which is omega, the big O, and then there's omicron, micro, with different sounds. And what they did is they just took those and lumped them on and stuck them at the end. And over the course of several thousand years, they kind of filtered out into the rest of our alphabet.
Yes, when it got changed into the Latin. I mean, the Romans adapted the Greek alphabet for their own use, didn't they? And with some Etruscan influence, I think.
Yeah, but so Jesus is saying in there that he's the beginning, the end. He was there in the creation, and he'll be there at the end of days. And that's clearly making him a divine figure.
It is making him a divine figure, but not that much more divine than anything you'll find, like in, say, First Enoch. It's a matter of whether divine in the sense of angelic or divine in the sense of, Son of God.
We'll go into that quickly before we go into numerology, is the use of the word angel. This comes up time and time again where John is referencing the angel of Ephesus, and the angel is actually considered, that was what they would have called the bishop of a city, is angel. Right. Back then, a lot of terms were used a little bit more loosely than they are now. They talk about elders, which in Greek was presbyteros, which we get our term priest from. But at that earliest time, there really wouldn't have been a big difference between priests and bishops. And so when he's writing that letter to the angels, he's really specifically saying that he's writing to the bishops or the head of the Christian community in each of those cities. And when they talk, he also references in there that he's talks to an angel that's very specifically meant to identify Jesus. That's one of the parts that gets very confusing for interpretation. Is he talking to an angelic being, or is he talking to Jesus?
Yes, and I wonder how much that sort of confusion or mishmash was in the minds of the community at that time.
Yeah, was it intentional mishmash, or was it something that we're missing?
Yeah, was it something that we're missing? Because now we're seeing it after almost 2,000 years. And we have very sharply demarcated concepts of Jesus as Son of God versus just an angel. But in those days, who knows what they thought.
Another part of it is that they would often use the word, it gets translated as saints, but saint was another thing that wasn't. Now we have the idea, if you say somebody, oh, Saint George or Saint this or that, it's a very specific thing, I think, that comes in most people's minds, that they've gone through like an investigation for their sainthood, and they've but saint just really comes from the word sanctus, holy. And back then, somebody who was even alive might have been called a saint. It was just somebody who was living up to the holy tradition that they were expected to live to. They didn't even necessarily have to be dead to be called a saint.
Right. I suppose, if in medieval times, I'm thinking, how vain would you have to be to accept that face on? If someone said, oh, Saint so-and-so, how are you? I'm fine. And
I almost wonder if it was a different a mindset. Like if you saw a monk who lived the lifestyle, oh, they're holy so-and-so. It didn't carry quite the same level that we did. Like I would think that a lot of people would say like Mother Teresa was holy in her life, but you wouldn't call her Saint Teresa while she was still alive before she went through the process. I think she went through the process.
Yeah, I think it's the Pope. Has she been canonized, or is she on the verge of being canonized?
I thought she did with John Paul II. They may have gotten canonized right around the same time.
Right. John Paul went out of his way to make saints, didn't he? I think he made a huge number of them.
Yeah, somebody who you would think that, then, oh, yeah, that's a great guy. He's holy. You'd say he was holy. Where, now it's taken on a different meaning than it carried at that time. And that's a big part of that whole book, is that things have taken on different meanings than they were intended to back then.
Yeah, things back then which were sort of designations are now formal titles.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get back into numerology. 12 is a huge number. The 12 tribes of Israel plus the 12 apostles. Those two 12s get us into a lot of the multiples of 12. So I don't know about you, but if you're going to read the Revelations, you better be able to multiply and divide the number 12 really, really quickly and really well. The number 144 comes out a lot. 12 12s. That's one of those really important numbers. Another important number that comes up is 666. That's another one that you may have heard of out there. Gary, what comes to your mind when you hear 666?
The beast, the end of times, the number of the beast.
Like in the Omen, didn't he have 666 on his head?
Yes, he did. The little kid had 666 on his head.
The sign of the beast.
The sign of the beast.
And that's one that people have a lot of fun with, like Mikhail Gorbachev, the prime minister of the Soviet Union. His birthmark kind of looked like a 666 if you looked at it a certain way and photoshopped it and Lord knows what else. 666, though, has a specific meaning. Now, some people think that it was that people attach numbers to the as kind of a number and wordplay of people's names, and you could turn Nero Caesar's full name into 666 in that word game. I don't necessarily buy that one.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what if you did any research on that.
I think that's the most common interpretation of 666, that it stands for Nero. And some scholars note that in some manuscripts the number is given as 616, which would also fit Nero if you drop the final Hebrew letter nun from Neron or Neron, whatever, however you'd pronounce it in Hebrew, into Nero. I don't know other interpretations. What have you got on that?
Another interpretation is that 666 is an imperfection of 7. That's 7 take away 1. Jesus in a trinity gives you 666. Mm-hmm. So it's really just a shorthand for imperfection.
Oh, okay.
Which kind of fits in more because Nero, after it's all said and done, wasn't that bad of a guy. He wasn't that bad of a guy to the Jews. He was there with the Jewish wars, but I don't think he was really that concerned with it. The real bad guys in the Jewish wars were Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian.
That's true. They were the generals who actually led the legions. Different
interpretations have had it that Nero persecuted Christians after the Great Fire of Rome. But if you read, there's a great book by Stephen Dando Collins, and he really gets into that. At that time, it would have been very difficult for a Roman official to pinpoint something on Christians. I know there's a lot of things that I think it was in Livy, there was a reference to the Christos.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
They're not 100% sure if that wasn't maybe redacted later.
Yeah, or and I think I read somewhere that Christos was actually a moderately common Greek name. It didn't mean Christos or whatever. It was actually a personal name.
There's a lot of confusion in that. We'll leave it at that. A lot of confusion to say that there was a decent amount of Jewish people living in Rome, but even at that time, there weren't a ton of Christ-believing Jews in the city of Rome. For why would you specifically target them? It was either you were targeting Jews in general, and then there's even theories that Nero was actually persecuting followers of Isis.
Oh, right.
Not Isis, the Egyptian god. But that's getting kind of off base. But I think in general, Nero probably wasn't the ultimate fall guy here.
Right. I mean, yeah, in the mid or late 60s, I suppose, the Christian community would not have been distinguished amongst themselves from the Jews, would they? It was still very early years.
Yeah, you're talking 30 years after the fact.
Yeah.
30 years and some change. I just don't think that, like you said, there would have been such a diversity of belief and a spectrum of belief that it would be very difficult for the Romans to come in and specifically target one group for persecution.
Yes.
I'm not saying that the myth of persecution, that's a book by, I believe her name was Candida Ross. I haven't read the whole book, but that's saying that Christians weren't really persecuted that bad. And it wasn't at that time, though, Christians being inside of this larger group of Second Temple Jews, which is where they fit, people are getting persecuted.
But probably unlikely because they were Christians.
Yeah, exactly. And those are the big ones. That's chapter 6 is where the 4 angels of the Euphrates raise an army of the 2 million cavalry to kill a third of mankind. And then the angel of 7 sounded the trumpet and hail and fire, blah, 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 burning a third of the earth's plants, killing a third of the things in the ocean. And then a third of the stars' lights diminished.
Oh, yeah, here we go. 8 verse 12. A third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars.
This third comes up, 1/3 of something. Some examples of it are that in verse 12 of chapter 8, the fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. And 3 angels, a third of the living creatures in the seas died, and a third of the ships were destroyed, and a third of the trees were burned up, and the green grass was burned up. That third means an incompleteness. It means that it wasn't completely destroyed. It wasn't half destroyed either. It was something less than fullness of it. That's a big one. And then that we talked about that number 1,000 again, that it's all playing with words and playing with numbers. And that was something that the initial people who were this book was directly targeted to would have understood all of this. And it moves us into our next part. I remember Gary saying that he read the book and he interpreted that there would be a Belgian dog catcher who was the beast. Where do we get from a book that was really specifically targeted to an audience, and then it turns into something completely different? How does that happen?
Yes, I mean, in popular culture today, there have been any number of books which have apocalyptic themes from Revelation. There, particularly with the number of the beast and the end of the world and the Antichrist, if we just start with the Omens series. So, I mean, Revelation is possibly bigger in popular culture today than it has been in a while, and it's still around. Yeah, there's fascination with it.
I was thinking as I read through the book, it brought me back to when I had read the Divine Comedy in the Inferno. That's very Revelation-like. That Dante is making, if you read the Inferno straight through, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you read the footnotes and you start to get these specific ideas, he was pulling a lot from Revelation in his book and where he was creating it. And especially when you pull, I think a lot of people stop with the Inferno, but if you carry on through to the Purgatorio and then the Paradise, it's very Revelation-like. So it's not just Left Behind and The Omen. This is a book that's really influenced Western thoughts since the earliest day.
Yes, in its own mysterious way. It's been endlessly fascinating, I suppose, because it's been so incredibly cryptic.
Yeah, that's probably the greatest thing with it, is that it's so cryptic. Another thing that struck me is that there's so much in there that heavily influences Catholic and Orthodox liturgy. And that's where it's come to be thought that it was actually a liturgical book. This is the first real example of, it's used several times, holy, 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 and this 3, that turns into eventually something that comes out of Middle Eastern Christianity called the Trisagion, the thrice holy. Holy is God, holy is mighty, holy is immortal. And those are actually taken straight out of the book. And that became big time around the 400s. Another thing is that there's this constant exhortation to come. It'll say, come hear this, come hear that. And that's something you'll hear very often in liturgical worship. And it carries through a liturgy where it's there's teaching, and then there's eschaton, and then it ultimately leads into the kingdom in that last chapter of the perfect of the second coming. And in those ways, it's very liturgical. And that's the way that the Catholics and the Orthodox see this book, as a very liturgical book.
Oh, okay.
And it almost can't be understood outside of that paradigm.
Right. I mean, the Protestants don't interpret it like that at all, do they? As a liturgical document. I mean, it appears as like hellfire and thunder.
Yeah, I think that they definitely take the eschatological parts of it.
Yeah.
But since they've really rejected so much of the liturgical,
Oh, that's a point, yes.
that they certainly wouldn't grab on to the liturgical aspects of it. One other thing that like we said, this layer of figurative language, like the great harlot and the beast who comes in as they say that the serpent in green and the harlot is red. It's using a lot of these like primary colors, and green was traditionally, especially during the Middle Ages, associated with evil.
Oh, was it?
Like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where green was representing evil. There's so much of that built into it that I don't think that, we could anywhere near scratch the surface of how many layers upon layers upon layers of figurative language they've built into this. I kind of feel like it was when I was in high school and read Shakespeare, and I couldn't understand the language, let alone that Shakespeare was really writing those so that the high class educated people would get a certain message, but also the rabble got a message out of it.
Yeah, I must admit, even today, I find it almost impossible to read Shakespeare. I have to see it actually performed to get the language. And even then, my brain's running about 5 seconds behind the dialogue. And after my brain's processed it, I go, oh, geez, that was clever.
And while we're talking about the harlot, that's another one, the harlot or whore of Babylon. That ties into, I think it is Ezekiel 16 through 23.
17:1. One of the things about the book of Revelation, which makes it unique amongst the apocalypses, is its concern with female sexuality and women. It's not something you find in any of the other apocalypses. The harlot, the woman, who's usually associated with Rome, is a figure that just doesn't appear anywhere else. And I'll give you an example of the importance of this, one of the female figures. Well, actually, there's two important female figures in Revelation. The biggest one we have from Revelation 17:1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came out and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of those fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk." So he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. That's pretty full-on stuff.
Yeah, and a lot of that's interpreted as this whore is Israel who's cheating on God. It's not like a woman in particular. It's saying that they're painting this relationship between Israel is the bride, God's the groom, and God's heaped all this good stuff on her. In that chapter, didn't it say about the white linens and he's given her all this good stuff, and then she still goes and hangs out with Baal when he's at work. That's a theme that runs through some of these Old Testament groups. And then it goes into Revelation as well, that the Scarlet Harlot, who the harlot and the whore of Babylon could be specifically talking about a woman prophetess in one of the Asia Minor cities, the Nicolaitans, who they've mentioned, who they were doing kind of like a weird, like using sexual relations as like prophecy. It could be literal like that it was talking about something that was historical, or it could be saying that Israel, the Jewish people as a whole, have been cheating on God and that they need to get right. There's those two plays that the author could have actually have been kind of playing with both of them.
Yes, quite a number of the Old Testament prophets associate Israel as a bride who has cheated on God. So that pops up in quite a number of the prophets. So there's that concept. But there certainly is one specific woman which John seems to be thinking of. In his letter to the church at Thyatira, in Revelations 2, he's writing to them, and to the angel of the church in Thyatira write, "These are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze." And then John says, verse 2:19, "I know your works, your love, faith, service, and patient endurance. I know that your last works are greater than the first. But I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet and is teaching and beguiling my servants to practice fornication and to eat food sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her fornication. Beware, I am throwing her on a bed, and those who commit adultery with her I am throwing into great distress, unless they repent of their doing, and I will strike her children dead." So this Jezebel seems to be a real person in Thyatira that John has a really big beef with.
Yeah, and they think that they may have been tied into certain Gnostics.
Oh, okay.
A certain Gnostic group where there was a woman prophetess. And he may have been actually building layers of meaning in there, that you're talking about unfaithful Israel and this woman.
And equating the two.
And because it really, if you look at what Jesus said in the canonical Gospels, like in Luke, where Jesus anoints the sinful woman. Let's see, what version is this from? The New International Version. Jesus is eating with the Pharisees and the usual setup. And then he says a woman anoints Jesus's feet with oil and, is like repentant. And again, he calls out Simon. That's Simon Peter. He calls him out again for not anointing his feet. But this sinful woman she anoints his feet out of nowhere, and he forgives her and tells her to go and sin no more. So you're talking about a literal sinful woman there who Jesus has forgiven, as opposed to in Revelation where they're really calling out, this kind of prototypical sinful bride. It's kind of an interesting comparison.
Yeah, I mean, John really does have a thing about it, doesn't it? And as I said, it does appear in the Old Testament prophets, but not in the apocalyptic literature, the Jewish apocalyptic literature. So this is a new thing which John is throwing in for that genre.
Yeah, and I think that's where it kind of gets very difficult for biblical exegesis, where the Gospels, definitely the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, can be taken in a pretty literal way. You don't have to really stretch them. Not literal. Literal can have different meanings, especially if you talk to like Robert Price. Literal has definitely a different meaning than maybe what traditional literalism is meant. But you can take what a lot of the things Jesus has said is pretty very literal. But when you go into Revelations, you start taking these things literally, and it just doesn't glue together.
No, it just doesn't make that much sense. Yeah, you're quite right. In the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels are a fairly easy read, and you can take everything quite literally as part of the narrative. But in Revelation, who knows what's going on?
Yeah, it really goes from the canonical Gospels, which are or the canonical New Testament, where it goes from Synoptic Gospels that are pretty straightforward, and then the Gospel of John, interesting, but pretty straightforward too. Acts are pretty straightforward. It's almost a historical accounting. The letters are just explaining what happened and applying it to their current situation. And then boom, Revelations. And it's like, what's that all about?
Yep. Where did that come from?
When we talked about this book, that it took quite a long time for it to really solidify. Initially, Revelation was really widely accepted. People like Justin Martyr and Polycarp of Smyrna, which Smyrna is one of the 7 cities. And then Polycarp of Smyrna's spiritual son, or his direct disciple, Irenaeus of Lyon, they accepted this book right away. And that's talking like within 50 years of the books being published in the 90s, like really quickly. And those are some heavy hitters too, like Justin Martyr's a big name, Irenaeus, Hippolytus of Rome, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, which, his writings are pretty widely respected. Whether he is or not, that's a different story. And a little bit later, Origen was big into Revelation, but he was a big allegorical guy. There was a time, though, where right after that, it got kind of murky, where people weren't very into it, such as there was a writer named Gaius who didn't really like it. And like we said, Dionysius of Alexandria had some problems with it. And it kind of chopped along until certain people thought that Revelation might not have even been written by John, but actually by a Gnostic heretic type person called Cerinthus, because of all the millennial talk, that within 1,000 years there was a heretic called Cerinthus who thought that he believed in a literal millennialism, that within 1,000 years all the stuff, the end times were going to happen. And it just kind of chipped along that way. Augustine of Hippo liked the book. Rufinus of Aquileia and Jerome and Augustine and all of those big names really liked the book. Oh, some big names like Danse of Alexandria, Eusebius of Caesarea, Cyril of Jerusalem, Gregory of Nazianzus, and John Chrysostom had major problems with it. The way that it was written, the grammar that was used in it, the style, they had gigantic might be a big word, too much for it, but they had enough problems with it that they thought that it probably shouldn't be included in the canon. So you have early writers like Irenaeus, Polycarp, Justin Martyr saying, hey, this is fine. Later writers, Dionysius of Alexandria, Gregory of Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, who are saying, no, this isn't cool in the East, but at the same time, Western writers who are starting to really warm up to it.
So it's much less popular in the East, and it's much less popular as time goes on. Is that right?
And then it kind of comes back into favor,
right,
where you can kind of see where people like Augustine of Hippo, his world was crumbling around him as he was writing. I think that when people who are going through tougher times, an apocalypse like this is a much friendlier book to you than people who maybe aren't seeing that same type of systematic societal crumbling.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like we said, there was books like The Shepherd Hermas that had a lot of really good stuff in it. That doesn't make the biblical canon. Several letters, like I think it was 2 Peter, doesn't make the cut. The Apocalypse of Peter doesn't make the cut. There was a negotiation process to how apostolic something was, and how much did it fit into what the church was, that the early church was trying to build as this is what we're presenting as our sacred literature.
Yes, I think the theory that they had was that a book would only get in if it was written by an apostle. But of course, that collided with the, well, we'd like to really put this book in, so let's pretend it was by an apostle.
Yeah, like the Shepherd Hermas, you can't pretend that was written by an apostle.
No.
Or the pseudo-Clementine literature, which is like, it's so long, first Clement and second Clement, that doesn't make sense at all. Like, you think that Revelation's tricky.
Oh.
The Clementine literature is mind-boggling. It reminds me a lot of like what you say about Enoch. It's really long. It's dense. It's just too much.
Oh, dear. Where they got the time to write this stuff? I just don't know. I mean,
physically write it, like handwriting, all this stuff. It's not like somebody just, mashing out a book. These are thousands of pages of writing, thousands and thousands of lines.
Yeah, of really dense prose.
And so that probably is how the fault line plays out, that the East accepts it with reservations. The West really embraced it. But to a point, as time progressed, by the time of the Reformation, Martin Luther doesn't write a commentary on Revelation, and he had serious problems with it. John Calvin doesn't write anything about it. Knox doesn't write anything about it. They had some serious problems with the book.
Yeah, all the early Protestants really weren't keen on it at all, were they?
And I don't know exactly why, because it kind of plays into their hand.
You'd think if they're struggling against the Catholic Church, you could easily find a pope or two in the beast, couldn't you? You'd think it'd be just perfect for their purposes.
And that's what happens later, is that the harlot of Rome and everything gets placed on popes in Rome. It's very difficult to read the book of Revelation in the standard sola scriptura way. That's kind of like the crack in the armor, because anybody can read that one however they want to.
Yes, it's like a huge Rorschach blot, isn't it? You can get whatever you like out of it.
And it was so difficult to comment on. It's difficult enough for modern commentators to write on, let alone people who didn't have the knowledge of Greek. It's just one of those books where you need to know the Greek that it was written in. You need to know the Hebrew. You need to know Latin. You need to know so many different pieces to tie it all together.
And when knowledge of those pieces disappears, the book becomes almost unintelligible in a lot of ways, I think.
And Revelation really helps us lead us into the last part of our series, which will be the next part, where we talk about the afterlife in Second Temple Judaism, which led into modern Judaism and Christianity, where you can go someplace pretty good or someplace pretty bad.
Or someplace indeterminate, as some people would have it.
Yeah, there's anywhere in between. You're going to land somewhere, and you're probably going to be judged one way or the other.
That's right, you're going to be judged. We'll see you next time for the final chapter in our series on the apocalypses.